Good morning, and welcome to the Carsey Policy Hour. For those of you joining for the first time, the Carsey Policy Hour is the UNH Carsey Schools of Public Policy's monthly discussion series, engaging policymakers, public service professionals, and active citizens and organizations in the issues and policies that affect the Granite State. Presentations, and slides are available online, including recent sessions on New Hampshire's civic health, prescription drug affordability, rural-urban voting trends, and investments in unsubsidized affordable housing. Our series partners are the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the New England Municipal Sustainability Network, or NEMS, and New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training with its Certified Public Manager program that feeds into Carsey's 4 master's programs. Today's Carsey Policy Hour looks at immigration policy, choices, and implications for New Hampshire. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Julia Gelatt of the Migration Policy Institute. MPI is an independent, nonpartisan think tank that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through authoritative research and analysis, opportunities for learning and dialogue, and the development of new ideas to address complex policy questions. Julia is Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program. This session could not be more timely. Just in the past week, New Hampshire has had a flurry of immigration policy-related headlines. Last Thursday, the House passed 2 bills aimed at undocumented immigrants in cities and schools. One of these prohibits state and local government entities from adopting sanctuary policies to prohibit or impede the enforcement of federal immigration law. On the same day, without as many headlines, a House bill that would require employers to use the federal E-Verify system to verify employment eligibility was voted inexpedient to legislate, though a similar bill is proceeding in the Senate, as well as a bill invalidating out-of-state driver's licenses that are issued specifically to undocumented immigrants. On Monday, a federal judge in New Hampshire blocked President Donald Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship for children born in the U.S. to parents without legal immigration status. And those headlines are just about immigration and just in New Hampshire, and a fire hose of other headlines that demand our attention. How do we take a deep breath, step back to understand the broader context, the historical frameworks, how trends and the broader view are shaping current events? In this case, what is the division between different levels of government and what they may or must do? And how does New Hampshire compare to other states in these choice points? Before I hand off to Julia to address some of these questions, 2 final notes. First, the Carsey School is an independent, nonpartisan organization. We do not have a position nor advocate on immigration issues. Through our discussion series, we try to offer critical context and a research-informed systems view of complex issues involving public policy. Second, you may hear references today to policies that have been challenged in court. Judicial checks and balances is not the topic of today's conversation. Save your questions in this realm, however, because next month's Carsey Policy Hour on March 12th will feature constitutional law professor Daniel Pye from the UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law on the relationship between lawsuits, courts, and executive actions. Mark your calendars. Finally, please put your questions and comments in the chat throughout Julia's presentation, since we will have Q&A and discussion in the final 30 minutes of today's session. Thank you so much for joining. Julia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Yussi, and it's great to be with all of you this morning. I'm really happy to be with you. I'm going to just get my slides up. So as Yussi mentioned, I am the Associate Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. We are a nonprofit, independent, nonpartisan think tank that looks at a wide range of immigration and immigrant integration issues, both in the U.S. and worldwide. We conduct research, we do policy analysis, we convene stakeholders and policymakers to discuss difficult topics, and we put forward new proposals for improving our immigration and immigrant integration policies. I'm part of our U.S. team. We also have our National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy that thinks about how immigrants in the United States can better integrate into our communities. We have an international program that looks at migration policies all around the world, and a specific focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, I'm going to first start with some numbers. How many immigrants are in the United States? How many immigrants are in New Hampshire? What are their legal statuses? And then I'll get into the roles of the federal government, state governments, and municipal governments in shaping policies that relate to immigration or the lives of immigrants. And then I'll hone in a little bit on how New Hampshire's state level choices compare to choices that other states have made. And then end by talking a bit about some of the rapid fire changes in immigration policy we've seen over the last few weeks at the federal level under the Trump administration, and play out some of the implications of that for New Hampshire, for governments, for service providers, and for communities. So we'll start with the numbers. Today in the United States, there are 48 million immigrants defined as foreign-born people, and they make up about 14.3% of the population. I should say these are 2023 numbers. We've been in a period of rapid growth, so the number today in 2025 is probably a little bit higher, and the percent is also probably a little bit higher. The purple line here shows that we've seen strong growth in the number of immigrants in the United States since the 1970s. And then the lime greenish line shows that we're approaching now the population share of immigrants that we saw as a peak in the late 1800s and early 1900s, around 15%. Immigrants come to the United States in many different ways. Immigrants come as permanent legal immigrants. Those are immigrants who have green cards through family sponsorship. That's the biggest channel. Through employer sponsorship or smaller numbers through our diversity visa program. The US grants about 1.1 million green cards per year for permanent legal immigrants. We also welcome hundreds of thousands of temporary immigrants each year. These include international students who study at our colleges and universities. They include temporary workers such as H-1B visa holders. Those are high-skilled workers who often work in tech industries. Those include H-2A temporary and seasonal farm workers who help to grow and harvest our food. It includes a whole alphabet soup of temporary visa programs for workers, for exchange visitors, for diplomats, and others. Immigrants also come through our humanitarian pathways. Depending on the year, we welcome tens of thousands or maybe up to 100,000 refugees each year. Refugees are people who have fled their home country because of fear of persecution. They live outside the United States, they're vetted abroad and resettled as legal refugees here in the United States. Other people are granted asylum. They come to the United States, they ask for protection, they say they're afraid to go home. They're vetted for their protection needs, and some are granted asylum and allowed to stay here in the US. And others have entered through other humanitarian pathways. The Biden administration made wide use of something called humanitarian parole, which allows people who don't have a visa to come and live in the United States. And of course, immigrants come to the United States without any permission at all. People come across the border without authorization, or they come on a temporary visa, maybe a visitor visa for a tourist, and overstay that visa and join our unauthorized immigrant population. But the great majority of immigrants in the United States do have legal status. The largest share of immigrants are naturalized citizens. So those are legal immigrants who went through the naturalization process and now they're US citizens and have the same rights as US born citizens. The next largest share are people who are lawful permanent residents or green card holders. And then unauthorized immigrants made up, at least in 2019, less than a quarter of our immigrant population. We're working on updating these data. I suspect if I was showing you this pie graph for today, that unauthorized immigrant share would be a little bit larger, but not substantially larger. Specifically in New Hampshire, there were 95,000 immigrants or foreign-born people in 2023. Those immigrants made up 6.8% of the state's population and 8.5% of the workforce. So compared to the over 14% in the US overall, you can see that the immigrant share in New Hampshire is smaller than the national average. And there were about 11,000 unauthorized immigrants in New Hampshire in 2019. So who has control over immigration policy and what kind of policies can they shape? The federal government has taken firm control of who's allowed to enter the United States and who's allowed to stay in the United States. The federal government decides how many immigrants can come legally each year, how many can come on permanent visas, how many on temporary visas, what are those categories of visas. Our current immigration system really privileges family sponsorship. We also have a system, as I mentioned, an alphabet soup of temporary visas, including work visas, exchange visas, student visas, and others. Our federal government sets the annual number of refugees that we want to resettle. It sets policies around who's eligible for asylum. It has chosen to extend some kind of temporary protections to people. Congress and the executive branch have had a role in that. The federal government sets our naturalization policies. The federal government also decides who gets to stay. So we know that many people violate our country's immigration laws, either coming across the border without permission or violating the terms of their visa or overstaying visas. The federal government decides how we handle those people. What are the consequences of violating our immigration laws? Who should be physically removed from the United States through deportation? How should we go about deporting people? At what level? We've certainly seen big changes in emphasis recently around deportations. And the federal government also decides how migrants are treated at our borders, not just the US-Mexico border, but our northern border, our seaports, our airports, et cetera. There are other federal policies that bear on immigrants, but I'm going to focus specifically today on our public benefits programs because those present a lot of choices for states. The federal government, of course, shapes all kinds of rights and benefits that all of us have here in the United States and for immigrants as well. But focusing in on public benefits policies, the federal government has restricted immigrant access to public benefits policies over time, especially in 1996. There was a restriction on legal immigrants' rights to public benefits in their early years. There are all kinds of public benefits policies that Americans draw on during times of economic need, and immigrants as well. Those include our public health insurance programs, Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. Those include SNAP, which is better known as food stamps, our food support program. Those include TANF, which is cash assistance for families with children, SSI, which is cash assistance for older and disabled folks, housing assistance, et cetera. There's a whole host of programs. States have no say in who comes into the United States, as that's under federal purview, and they have very little say in who's removed from the United States, although we'll talk more about states' role in that. But they have a lot of say about how immigrants in their state are treated, what rights are extended to which categories of immigrants, and how much immigrants are incorporated into the thinking that happens in state policymaking. So states have made various choices that I'll spell out a little bit more in future slides around funding state-funded benefits for immigrants who are excluded from federally funded benefits. That includes unauthorized immigrants who have almost no access to public benefits. It also includes permanent legal immigrants in their first 5 years in the country, and it affects temporary immigrants who also have almost no access to federally funded public benefits. States can decide how much to build an immigrant focus into their state policy making and into the work that they do every day. Some states have established a body, often called an Office of New Americans or Office of Immigrant Affairs, to make sure that the particular needs of immigrants are reflected throughout the decisions that the state is making. Other states have explicit language access policies, since language access is one of the key immigrant-specific needs. States have made various choices about expanding the rights and benefits of unauthorized immigrants specifically, considering whether to offer driver's licenses, in-state tuition, state financial aid, professional licenses, or other benefits, regardless of immigration status. And then states have decisions to make and make decisions around how much to cooperate in federal immigration enforcement efforts, and also whether to set their own state immigration enforcement bills. Now, on this last topic, there has been some litigation around some of these state efforts to create state enforcement laws or laws against being in the state without status or specific forms of state participation in immigration enforcement. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then municipalities, cities also have choices about how to treat the immigrants in their cities. They have even less control than states in deciding who gets to come and who gets to stay. That's all set at the federal level. But municipalities can think about providing economic supports for immigrants during times of need. We saw this particularly during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. There were some cities around the country that opted to provide financial assistance to unauthorized immigrants who lost their jobs and were ineligible for unemployment insurance programs. Cities can set their own focus on immigrant needs. There are many cities who have a mayor's office of immigrant affairs or New Americans that embed a focus on immigrants into the city government. Cities can't issue driver's licenses, but some have issued city-level identification cards that assist unauthorized immigrants in interacting with all kinds of government agencies. And cities, specifically sheriffs and local police departments, can make decisions about how much to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement efforts. There have also been some city-level immigration enforcement policies that have been enacted in certain times and places, I think more so in sort of the late 2000s than right now, but those include policies around restricting unauthorized immigrants' access to utility contracts or to rental agreements, or in other ways trying to make it difficult for unauthorized immigrants to live in a particular community. So let's focus in a little bit more on some of the choices that various states have made and how New Hampshire sort of is situated in that picture. So I mentioned that states have a lot of choices they can make on using state dollars to fund public benefits for immigrants who can't access federal programs. There are states that have gone quite far in expanding the public benefits available to legal immigrants in their first 5 years, as well as to unauthorized immigrants, as these groups are excluded from federal benefits. So over half of states use state funds to fill in that 5-year wait for legal immigrants for at least one benefits program. And New Hampshire's counted in that half of states. New Hampshire provides SSI, which again is cash assistance for elderly or disabled people, to legal immigrants in their first 5 years. But they have not opted, New Hampshire's not opted to fund other public benefits for legal immigrants in their first 5 years. Except that there is a federal option for states to use mostly federal dollars, but with a state match to fund public health insurance, so Medicaid and CHIP for children and pregnant women in their first 5 years as a permanent legal immigrant. New Hampshire is a sort of late joiner to this group of 38 states plus DC that have taken up this federal option to expand public health insurance. There are also states that have opted to fund public health insurance to all residents, regardless of status, or to fund public health insurance to children, regardless of status. Some states fund public health insurance only for very young unauthorized immigrant children. Others expand all the way up to 19 or other ages. New Hampshire has not made either of these choices to expand public health insurance to unauthorized immigrants. And then some states have chosen to expand food assistance to immigrants regardless of status. Sometimes those are pretty narrow categories, and New Hampshire is not in that group either. I mentioned that some states have built an explicit immigrant focus into the state through establishing an Office of New Americans or Immigrant Affairs. I don't have a count of how many states have made this choice, but it's a sizable number, and New Hampshire is not among these states. And New Hampshire is also not among the 13 states plus Washington, D.C. that have a specific language access policy. In terms of other rights and benefits that some states have expanded specifically to unauthorized immigrants, New Hampshire has generally not taken up these options. So 19 states plus DC offer limited use driver's licenses to unauthorized immigrants. The logic for that is that states feel or have made the choice that it's safer if everybody can register for a license and show the police if they're pulled over that they have some kind of official documentation and also permission to drive. Other states feel that it's not appropriate to extend that kind of right to somebody who is in the country without authorization. 25 states plus DC offer in-state tuition at public colleges and universities to all children who grow up in the state, regardless of immigration status. And 19 states plus DC also offer financial aid to unauthorized immigrant kids who grew up in the state, and New Hampshire has not joined those states. And then 21 states have opened at least some access to state occupational licenses to immigrants regardless of status, whereas 2 states have policies explicitly barring unauthorized immigrants from those licenses. New Hampshire has neither policy. This might sound like a strange thing because unauthorized immigrants aren't able to work legally in the United States, but there are actually a sizable number now of people who don't have a visa and don't have a firm legal status, but have some kind of temporary protection that gives them access to work authorization. So you might be familiar with the DACA program. That's a program that allowed people who came to the United States without status as children and have lived here for a fairly long time to apply for temporary protections and work authorization. These policies around professional licenses can help those DACA holders. It can also help people who have been granted temporary protections through temporary protected status or through humanitarian parole. Okay, so states also face choices around cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. And just to step back for a minute, I wanted to explain how immigration enforcement tends to work in the interior of the United States. So Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is the agency that carries out arrests and removals of unauthorized immigrants who are found within the interior of the country. ICE is responsible for finding where people are, identifying who is deportable, arresting them, detaining them, potentially monitoring them in other ways, and then arranging for their deportation from the country. When most of the arrests that ICE conducts actually happen through local law enforcement agencies. So when somebody's arrested for a crime, whether that's a very minor crime or a very major crime, they'll be taken to a police or sheriff's station, they'll be fingerprinted. Those fingerprints will then be checked against all kinds of databases, FBI databases, national security databases, and immigration databases. If that person's fingerprints match with a person who's known to be in the country without authorization, or they match with somebody who already has a removal order, who's already been told to leave the country but hasn't left, that will send a notification to ICE. ICE will then ask the local law enforcement agency to please hold that person up to 48 hours for ICE to take custody. Or ICE will say, please let us know when that person will have finished serving their sentence, whether in jail or in prison, and then we'll take custody and process that person for removal. ICE also conducts arrests out in the community, and these get a lot more media attention than the arrests that happen at jails and prisons. ICE may go to people's home, their work, try to find them along their commute. They may go out into public spaces and try to identify unauthorized immigrants and arrest them. But these at-large arrests, they're generally really expensive and resource intensive for ICE. Usually they're targeted also. Right now, ICE says that they're targeting people who have a prior removal order or who have a serious criminal conviction. When they figure out where somebody lives, they plan an operation with multiple ICE agents, and then they go to conduct that arrest. They may also interview other people who are in the vicinity to see if they're removable as well. But the point here is that most ICE arrests, about 3/4, happen through prisons and jails. And that means that local cooperation with ICE really shapes the level of immigration enforcement that happens. There are jurisdictions around the country that say, we will not hold anybody those extra 48 hours for ICE. Some jurisdictions don't want to bear the cost. Some jurisdictions believe that it's not constitutional to hold people past their criminal sentence for a civil law infraction. And some have faced litigation from groups like the ACLU for holding people. Other jurisdictions will hold migrants, but only if they have a serious criminal conviction or present some kind of other risk to the community. And then there are other jurisdictions that will not hold people for ICE, but they'll communicate with ICE and they'll tell ICE exactly when somebody is going to be released. So there can be a handoff from local law enforcement to ICE. There are 11 states that have state laws that in some way limit local law enforcement's cooperation with ICE, at least to some extent. And then there are all kinds of local law enforcement agencies across the United States that have decided for themselves to set restrictions on their cooperation. And then conversely, there are 20 states that have state laws mandating at least some level of cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. And there are jurisdictions all across the country that have decided on their own without a state law that they would like to cooperate with ICE. As I'm sure you all know, and as Yusi mentioned, New Hampshire is considering a bill right now that would require local law enforcement to contact ICE if they arrest a non-citizen and ICE flags that non-citizen. But right now, New Hampshire doesn't have either kind of law on the books enacted. And then finally, states have made a variety of choices around state level immigration enforcement. So we've seen states such as Florida and Texas and Iowa and others pass laws that create state laws prohibiting somebody from entering the state without immigration status or living in the state without immigration status, or create a crime for people who transport unauthorized immigrants into the state or around the state. There are state policies refusing to recognize driver's license issued to unauthorized immigrants in other states. And then there are a number of states that require the use of E-Verify. When an employer hires a new worker, they're of course required to check that that person's authorized to work in the United States. That's usually a paper-based process, but the Federal Electronic Verification System, or E-Verify, allows employers to also enter that information into a database and conduct a check using that database to see if that person is work authorized. Right now, federal contractors are required under federal law to use E-Verify, but quite a number of states have opted to create their own mandates. There are 23 states that require the use of E-Verify for at least some hires. Sometimes that's, again, for state contractors, and sometimes that's for all larger employers, and sometimes it's for all employers. Some of these policies around creating state-level laws criminalizing living in the state without status have been litigated, and some of them have been blocked in court. In particular, when states have tried to create a state effort to have their local police identify and even deport unauthorized immigrants, those measures have faced the most constraints through litigation and the sense that immigration enforcement is something that the federal government is meant to control under our current laws and constitution. But some of the state laws have been allowed to go forward on this front. So I wanted to end by talking a little bit about the flurry of immigration policy changes that we've been seeing from the Trump administration and what those might mean for New Hampshire. So we've seen just, I think it was 10 executive actions on the very first day that President Trump was in office, and quite a number of announcements and smaller policy changes since then that have sought to generally stop new unauthorized immigrants from coming into the United States, also stopping people coming on some kind of temporary status, and also seeking to identify, locate, and deport larger numbers of unauthorized immigrants. At the border, we've seen overlapping layers of policies to try to prevent people from entering. There's an emergency declaration that says that it's not in our national interest to allow people in and access to our asylum system across the border. We've been working with Mexico to restart a program where migrants who come to the border have to wait in Mexico and present their asylum claims while living in Mexico. There are still on the books some of the Biden administration policies strongly restricting access to asylum for people who enter between ports of entry. And we saw the end of a program that President Biden had created that allowed people to make an appointment at a legal crossing point to seek to enter the United States through humanitarian parole. Exactly what's happening at the border is a little bit hard to know right now. We know that encounters at the border have dropped significantly, and we also know that it's probably very difficult for people coming to the border to come into the United States to stay and to seek protection here. The Trump administration has also ended all kinds of humanitarian programs that the Biden administration created to allow people in. There's currently a pause on refugee resettlement, so no refugees are being resettled. There's, because of a funding pause, also a pause on Afghans and Iraqis who come in with special immigrant visas. We saw the end of parole programs that were allowing Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, and also Ukrainians who had sponsors in the United States. They were able to come to the United States in recent years, and those programs have ended, or at least are on pause. And we've also seen the Trump administration announce the end of temporary protected status, the temporary right to live and work in the US, for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. We haven't seen much action yet on legal immigration, but some of the executive orders indicated things that may be coming. So one executive order said that the government should study whether there are countries that should have a ban on immigration from those countries to the United States based on national security concerns. There's also an executive order that calls for very strongly tightening the vetting of legal immigrants. In the last Trump administration, we saw this tighter vetting. It didn't reduce the levels of legal immigration, at least until the pandemic, but it did slow down our legal immigration system. And then, of course, we've heard about the plans for mass deportations to find, arrest, and deport a larger number of unauthorized immigrants living in the United States. ICE now is operating under daily arrest quotas. I guess there was a change in leadership at ICE yesterday because of disappointment in the pace of operations. So there's a big effort to really ramp up our immigration enforcement system. And we know that Congress is right now considering, the US Congress is considering adding more funding and resources to immigration enforcement. These changes present a number of choices and implications for New Hampshire service providers, law enforcement, and communities. We're seeing fewer migrants coming in from the border, fewer migrants coming in through humanitarian parole programs, and right now fewer refugees coming in. This will likely lead to fewer new immigrants arriving to New Hampshire without a firm legal status. We know that some of those migrants were showing up to communities with big needs, big service needs for housing, for economic support, for healthcare, and other assistance as they got on their feet and spent their early days in the United States. So those costs that New Hampshire was bearing may go down. On the other hand, refugees come with federal dollars attached for their resettlement assistance. So fewer refugees coming in means less money for refugee resettlement service providers. With immigrants losing work authorization as their temporary protections end, such as TPS or humanitarian parole, and with possibly fewer legal immigrants, this could affect the workforce in New Hampshire. Employers could lose access to some of their current workers who lose their work authorization, or they could have a harder time hiring new immigrant workers from abroad. This could lead to a shrinking of the labor force and the consumer base in New Hampshire as well. Intensified immigration enforcement creates a lot of fear in immigrant communities that has spillover effects for the many service providers that work with immigrant families, whether those are unauthorized immigrants or US citizens who live with unauthorized immigrants, or legal immigrants who have a higher sense of fear for themselves as well. This affects schools, healthcare providers, and other service providers, and will certainly increase the demand for immigrant legal service providers. And then intensified immigration enforcement also presents a growing set of decisions for local law enforcement about how to engage and in what ways. There are choices ahead for New Hampshire, whether those are focused on new efforts to attract workers amid a declining immigrant workforce. Perhaps there are opportunities to attract workers from other states to New Hampshire instead of attracting immigrants. There are choices ahead in how to respond to this period of heightened federal enforcement. We know that New Hampshire is actively debating how to shape its state cooperation with federal law enforcement, and depending on the shape of that state bill that eventually passes there and becomes law, there may be some choices still left for local law enforcement to decide within those parameters. There's also choices ahead on restricting or expanding the rights of unauthorized immigrants in the state. Questions around driver's licenses, around opening professional licenses, around other opportunities for unauthorized immigrants, or restricting those opportunities. And then as other states consider state level immigration enforcement laws and e-verify mandates, New Hampshire, as Yusi mentioned at the beginning, is considering an e-verify law and has other choices ahead in terms of state level immigration enforcement. So I'll leave it there, but I really look forward to all of your questions in the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. Julia has indicated her openness to follow up after. Also, the slides and presentation will be uploaded for others to view by Friday of this week. We've had some great questions entering in the questions and chat so far. Keep those coming. I'll note that some of those are strongly worded, and I will do my best to frame the questions in, again, this nonpartisan, independent academic view so that we can understand the broader context So, again, in this goal of context setting, Julia, you've described the relationship between these different levels of government. I'd love to also slice this in terms of time. How has the relationship between federal, state, and local authority and responsibility regarding undocumented or unauthorized immigrants changed over time?
In our country's early years, in the first 100 years of the United States, it was really up to states to decide who could come to their state and also who could be removed from the state. So we saw state level immigration policies, especially restrictions around poor immigrants who needed assistance coming to states. And we saw states actually deporting immigrants themselves. In the 1880s, the federal government and Congress passed a law to seize federal control of who gets to come and stay in the United States, which left states with more control around how they treated immigrants in the state, but less say in who could come and who could stay. And then we saw states start to become much more active on immigration in the late 2000s, early 2010s. There was a period of high arrivals of unauthorized immigrants in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And Congress was set to respond in the 2006-7 period. Well, it was first set to respond when President Bush, George W. Bush, first came into office, and then 9/11 happened, and that derailed all of those immigration policy reforms. And then there was another period of attempts in 2006-7. Those failed, and Congress really failed to make changes to our immigration policy that jurisdictions were hoping for. And so states said, if the federal government is not going to do this, let's take this into our own hands. And states started passing immigration restriction laws at the state level. You might remember Arizona's SB 1070 of 2010. And then there were some follow-along laws in other states, especially in the Southeast in 2011. Those state laws all face litigation. Some of the provisions were blocked, others were allowed to go forward. But we're now seeing a new wave of states being frustrated at the federal government's control of immigration and wanting to take more control at the state level as well. And then, as was reflected by what I was showing about some of the state decisions around expanding rights to unauthorized immigrants, we've also seen a kind of quieter and slow rolling effort to expand rights of unauthorized immigrants in states who see it as pragmatic to affirmatively provide some of these benefits to unauthorized immigrants to reduce some of the emergency responses that are needed. For example, if you provide public health insurance to people regardless of status, that can help to prevent sort of unexpected emergency healthcare costs for people who don't have insurance. So we've seen both trends. We've seen states trying to emphasize immigration enforcement kind of on and off, and then a slower expanding of rights for unauthorized immigrants in some other states.
Thank you. That's fantastic. When New Hampshire does face a budget shortfall. The New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute's latest estimate was a $39 million revenue deficit this fiscal year. One of the reasons for the deficit is the shortfall in our two business taxes. And so I wonder if you could drill into states that are facing fiscal challenges and how they weigh, as you say, short-term versus long-term health costs, the different economic benefits, labor force, consumer base, against the costs of providing these public benefits.
Yeah, so certainly in a time of budget shortfall, it would be hard, I think, to argue for expanding public health insurance to immigrants who are excluded from federal health insurance policies. That tends to bring a cost, although it can offset some of the emergency costs, as I was mentioning. On the other hand, we know that immigrants, especially high-skilled immigrants, contribute really strongly to the workforce in many states and across the United States, and especially high-skilled immigrants are net fiscal contributors at both the federal and the state level. In our country's demographic picture, we have more aging people than we have new babies being born. So immigration is becoming increasingly important for growing our younger population and growing our workforce. So I think New Hampshire and other states sort of have some considerations around whether it's important to attract more immigrants to hasten the growth of the workforce and speed the growth of the workforce, or whether that, is offset by some of the short-term needs that new immigrants may have in their first years, especially in the United States.
Any data on the relationship with housing availability? One of the questions asked, might fewer unauthorized immigrants in New Hampshire also positively affect the housing shortage?
Yeah, that's a tough picture because on the one hand, excuse me, morning frogginess. On the one hand, immigrants, of course, fill housing, and we have not built enough housing to keep up with the growth in population in the United States. On the other hand, we know that immigrants form a large share of the construction workforce, and that construction workforce is really important for our ability to build new houses, especially in an affordable way. So it sort of depends on the balance of whether those immigrants are also contributing to housing development and housing construction. I think there, I know at least in DC, in Washington, DC, where I live, there are problems around the permitting of new housing and allowing more construction. And I think that some of those policies might have a bigger effect on housing supply and housing costs than the number of immigrants, especially in a state like New Hampshire that has a relatively smaller immigrant population.
We have questions I see from the two reporters who are on the call. Seeking additional context. So how does New Hampshire compare to the rest of New England with regard to policies that limit cooperation with ICE? And there are additional questions about which two other states prohibit occupational licenses for unauthorized immigrants, which of the 11 states that have laws limiting local law enforcement's cooperation with ICE. Do you have resources that you could share either now or following the call for, to be able to drill down on different states' approaches to these policy choices?
Yes, I'd be happy to share some resources afterwards that that have these state compilations. I don't have all of these in my head right now. I can tell you that that in New England there are more states that have limited their cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. The states that have prohibited sanctuary policies are more commonly in the Southeast and the West, although sort of scattered across the United States. And I'm sorry, what was the second, the second specific question was around the.
Simply resources. So, there was asking for the laws that limit local law enforcement's. Anyway, you'll share some of the MPI and other work, such as that state enforcement map that we've discussed, that can help provide, again, these more detailed comparisons.
Yes, happy to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. You share with ICE and enforcement and emphasizing that 3/4 of the removals are through the judicial system, and relying often on a prior removal order or a serious criminal conviction. I think a concern is that there are radical changes underway that, for example, would mean that raids are occurring without these prompts for it, or even that some of the removals or ICE interactions could be based on accusations versus a presumption of innocence for those who might be accused maliciously. And so I wonder what you're seeing or what you would anticipate in terms of the shift in approach, I guess, and how much immigrant communities without documentation should be worried about these radical shifts.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's hard to know exactly, and it will take some time before we have data to really be sure. On the one hand, ICE, in trying to amplify the number of arrests that they conduct, they're looking for the most efficient path to arresting people, making sure that anybody who's arrested by local law enforcement and known to be in the country without authorization is arrested by ICE is the most efficient way for them to boost their numbers. It takes many fewer resources for a single ICE agent to take someone who's in local custody into their custody, and then begin to process them for removal. It takes a lot more resources to conduct an operation out in the community. So simply because of logistical and practical reasons, I do suspect that we'll continue to see a lot of arrests happening through local law enforcement. That doesn't mean that these are, you know, quote unquote bad guys. There are places where there aren't driver's licenses available for unauthorized immigrants, and where you know, police or sheriffs are very actively enforcing traffic violations. So somebody might be pulled over because they didn't signal when they changed a lane. They're found to not have to be driving without a valid driver's license. They're arrested for driving without a license and then handed over to ICE. Of course, other people are arrested for very serious crimes and are really a danger to the community and then handed over to ICE. We do know, though, that there's, you know, we've heard about ICE conducting operations out in the community. And from the reporting, some of those sound to be very random. A family that's at a grocery store and speaking Spanish, in that case, happened to be Puerto Rican and not at all removable, but that ICE arrested those folks. And we know that ICE is, when they're going to find someone who's on their target list, they might go to an apartment building and they knock first on the door of the person that they're seeking, but then they knock on every other door in that apartment building to see if there might be somebody else who doesn't have status. If ICE questions somebody and that person volunteers that they don't have legal status, ICE can arrest them. So, you know, it's hard to know. There's been some early reporting that half of people arrested by ICE in the last couple of weeks have had a criminal conviction, I think, or a criminal accusation, and half haven't, which would be a pretty low rate compared to historical numbers. But it's going to take some time to see how this plays out. And once somebody's arrested, they very well may not end up being deported. People have the right to contest their deportation. They can ask for asylum in the United States or other protections in the United States. And it's probably more likely that somebody with a criminal conviction who's arrested will be deported, whereas somebody without one may have more opportunities to find ways to stay in the United States.
We have Ken Johnson from Carsey noting that in New England and elsewhere, immigrants play an important role in the dairy industry, providing much of the labor force that actually milks and processes dairy products. The loss of these immigrants would have a significant impact on the ability to provide milk and dairy products. So that's interesting. Will, he asks about policy discussions or lobbying efforts to address this issue, probably better geared towards our New Hampshire policymakers. We have a comment that asks, why do you conflate immigrants with unauthorized immigrants? This makes the conversation stilted and less helpful. New Hampshire is working to get unauthorized immigrants out of our state. Immigrants that are here authorized receive benefits. And I'll just, from my perspective, our discussion today is primarily looking at unauthorized immigrants and state policy choices for that group in particular, while rooted in the broader immigration system. And Julia, I wonder, are there places where we might have conflated that need to be clarified?
Yeah, I definitely didn't mean to conflate, and that's actually why I did want to start with that pie chart, just showing that most immigrants are here legally. But it's true that a lot of the state choices that I was talking about relate to unauthorized immigrants, and so I think that's where that may have come across. I do apologize. Apologize for that. States have some choices around legal immigrants, but those sort of relate to the economic structure of the state and what opportunities there are for jobs for legal immigrants. We know that immigrants go to places where there's economic opportunity. That's why so many people want to come to the United States, because they can earn more here than in most other places in the world and have more opportunities to advance their careers. So, New Hampshire could focus on economic development, on attracting high-skilled immigrants through economic opportunities. Also, could lobby for policies to allow more immigrants in needed industries who might not have college degrees but play really vital roles in the economy. I'm from Wisconsin. I hear you on the dairy industry. There's a lot of problems in the dairy industry in finding workers. They're not able to use the H-2A visa program, and there isn't a good way for the dairy industry to sponsor workers. That's something that I know has gotten attention on and off. So there are choices around legal immigration, but they're more around attracting those immigrants. Legal immigrants, for the most part, have the same rights in many domains as U.S. citizens, so that presents fewer policy questions.
And connected to this distinction, you and I talked earlier about some of the spillover effects that a focus on removing undocumented immigrants might have on legal immigrants. Could you speak to what you're seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've had really high inflows of unauthorized immigrants in recent years, and public sentiment in the country has really been very concerned about that and about the detrimental effects of people coming without authorization and the cost to localities. That's turned public opinion against legal immigration as well. And some of the rhetoric around immigrants that focuses on crimes that immigrants commit and focuses on the downsides of immigration, that can spill over into how people perceive legal immigrants, just like it affects their perceptions of unauthorized immigrants. And so sometimes we see reactions sort of conflating unauthorized immigrants and legal immigrants and not distinguishing between the two.
Can you clarify that asylum seekers are in the US legally as they wait for their claim to be verified?
Yep, people who have applied for asylum are allowed to stay until the conclusion of the asylum process. There are many people who came to the border and crossed without authorization, crossed illegally, but then requested asylum. They are still allowed to stay in the country as their asylum claims are pending. And many people's asylum claims are pending for a very long time. Our asylum system is completely backlogged, and it's taking quite a number of years for those cases to be resolved.
We have a number of questions about the details of ICE. So the protocol of how a law enforcement would know that an immigrant they arrested has been flagged. Who sets the rules that govern ICE's behavior? The rationale behind certain judges' decisions, and that will be beyond our scope today. Just looking at the time. But clearly a lot of questions about the transparency for for some of the decisions that are made. Do we know how realistic is President Trump's plan to hold 30,000 migrants in detention centers?
Right now, Congress has funded ICE to detain 41,500 people. So that's the number of beds that are available in ICE detention centers. There's also right now additional numbers of people who are being detained at a military facility in Colorado. And of course, I'm sure you all have heard about the transfers of some migrants to Guantanamo Bay. And there are, I've lost track of what that number is, but a smallish number of people who are being held there. We know that Congress, the federal US Congress, is considering increasing funding for immigration enforcement through the reconciliation process. They're undoubtedly going to increase the number of detention beds that ICE has available. And the number of detention beds does matter. When ICE arrests somebody, they may be put into ICE detention. But given the limited number of ICE beds, if that person doesn't have a serious criminal conviction, they may well be let back out into the community pending their immigration court hearing. Immigration court cases for people who are detained tend to move faster than immigration court cases of people released into the community. And people cannot be deported until they have a final removal order. Usually that comes from that immigration court process. So detaining people helps the government make sure they know where that person is and that they'll follow through with their process. That also means they're in a faster removal process, but there's no way for the federal government to detain the vast majority of people who are in the country without authorization.
Right. Our final two questions return to the theme of the different levels within the government structure of responsibility and authority. One of these, there are two questions on immigrant children. So what responsibility do public officials have for the welfare when arrests occur? So if they are not protected and can be left alone. Another related question, thought on the impact to child welfare agencies if parents are deported without their children. The foster system is very taxed as it stands.
There are roughly around 5 million US-born US citizen children who have at least one unauthorized immigrant parent. So there are certainly spillover effects of immigration enforcement on children. If an unauthorized immigrant parent is arrested and is about to be deported, it's their choice whether their family wants to travel back to the home country with them or whether their family wants to stay in the United States. In many cases, because a lot of arrests happen through the criminal justice system, and for a lot of other reasons, a lot of the ICE arrests and deportations are of men. So it's often the case that the father of a family might be deported and the mother is not deported. In other situations, if ICE knocks on a door looking for someone and they interview everyone else in the house, both parents might be arrested and processed for deportation. If there's a big worksite enforcement effort and the parents work together, both parents might be arrested. The parents can decide if they want to bring their children with them. I'm not very clear on the logistics of exactly how that happens. The parents might be allowed to travel with the children rather than on an ICE plane, depending on the circumstances. Or if parents think that their children would have better opportunities in the United States if they see their home country as really unsafe or not a place where they want their children to be, the children are sometimes left behind. And in that case, they would end up in the child welfare system. It's for this reason, it's really important for families where there are parents who don't have legal status to make a family plan in advance of something happening so that there's a clear directive of who would take custody of the children, even temporarily while parents are in detention, but also sort of what the intention of the family is in terms of traveling together or children staying in the United States for the opportunities here.
Thank you. You mentioned our HB 511, the Anti-Sanctuary Cities bill. It was actually amended to remove language calling for local law enforcement to provide broad cooperation and best efforts to assist. So the focus on not impeding versus the the requirement to provide that broad cooperation. The New Hampshire Municipal Association, the New Hampshire Association of Counties have also weighed in, really focusing on the concerns over local resources and local decision making. And so that regardless of what one's feelings are about immigration, even if it were the opposite mandate to prevent local departments from working with ICE. NHMA has no position on immigration policy or other immigration related changes, but it's an issue of local control. I wonder if you're seeing that play out in other states and how these tend to be resolved. These discussions or counterforces tend to be resolved.
Yeah, there can be a lot of tensions between state policies and then local law enforcement agencies' desires, whether that's a state that has prohibited cooperation with ICE or whether that's a state that has mandated cooperation with ICE. Local law enforcement agencies are weighing a lot of considerations when they think about how much to cooperate with ICE and federal immigration enforcement. On the one hand, it's very frustrating for local authorities if they're arresting the same person over and over for committing crimes, and that person isn't supposed to be living in the United States to begin with. In that case, they may wish to help get that person out of their community and out of the country. On the other hand, local law enforcement really wants trust with the local community. They rely on the public to report crimes, and if immigrants are scared to interact with the police, that can impede local law enforcement's efforts and investigations. There are also those constitutional questions around holding people for ICE on a civil violation and also the costs involved in holding people for ICE. So I think local law enforcement agencies would always prefer to be in control of that decision and not be told by their state government or by the federal government which thing that they have to do. They would like to decide that for themselves, but there are a lot of considerations around those decisions.
Well, Julia, I think we could continue this all day, all week. We need to wrap up, but I just want to thank you for your time, for providing this broader context. Julia Gelatt, Associate Director of U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Carsey Policy Hours are on the second Wednesday of each month at 8 in the morning. On March 12th, as I mentioned, we'll hear from constitutional scholar Daniel Pai at the UNH Law School on the historical and recent relationships between lawsuits, courts, and executive policy making. So that should be another interesting discussion. As we did today, Carsey hopes to provide critical context, a systems view of complex issues that affect New Hampshire and the nation in a nonpartisan and academic way. In April, to commemorate Earth Day, Carsey's director, Stephen Bird, will focus on energy and sustainability policy. And May brings a story of a unique collaboration between a gas utility and climate activists, which resulted in the first geothermal system ever built by a gas utility and a promising partnership model. This session is co-produced with NEMS, the New England Municipal Sustainability Network. Registration information will be online soon. You don't have to wait. You can set aside 8 to 9 o'clock on the second Wednesday of each month and join us on March 12th for the next Carsey Policy Hour. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again to Julia, and see you next month.